Good morning, everybody. It's Baker's Corner again. Hope you are doing well. We get to dive into today one of the most interesting presidencies in the modern era and a time period that we a lot of times call the rise of Reagan conservatism. So let's get into this and focus on, we're going to do this in two parts. The first part today will be mostly an overview of Reagan's elections, his domestic policy, how he's going to try to combat some of the economic problems that he inherits from the previous administrations from the 70s. And we're also going to look briefly at his policy of deregulation and some of the other things that he did to try to also move our economy further. Okay. And so a couple of things on our screen now you want to focus on is we want to be able to explain how certain groups of Americans, mostly conservative groups in some respects, but also you're going to see some support by other parties, particularly Reagan Democrats, as they became known as, and how did they really play a significant role with Reagan's election in 1980, but also his reelection in 1984. We also want to be able to explain the basic principles of Reagan conservatism and give examples. Now, if you looked at our previous video where we kind of introduced Reagan's rise to stardom, so to speak, or kind of his rise to the presidency, we said to list these. Today, we're going to go to the next step with this and basically look in a little bit more detail. So we're going to look at another element of this. And this is something that we're going to kind of do today a little bit more in a thematic sense to start off. So I will kind of give you some guidelines about where to maybe pause and really kind of really reflect on some things as we work through these. So be ready to roll. We also want to explain probably one of the more well-known economic policies of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and that became known as Reaganomics after him, but it by no means is just simply Reagan in its thinking. That's why we also refer to it a lot of times as supply side economics. Okay, so we want to be able to explain that theory. How does Reagan use it? What is the reasoning behind it? And also, what are some of the pros? And also, on the other side, some of the cons, because we want to have a degree of balance with looking at it. All right. And then lastly, we want to be able to think, and this will be a little bit more geared toward the students that are completing the primary source speech analysis outside of this lecture, but we'll get into that a little bit. How does Reagan's leadership impact the country, especially in times of crisis? Like those that might be watching this that are adults probably remember in 1986, the Challenger explosion. I'll talk more about that in a moment for the students that are maybe unfamiliar with it. And that was a really big time. I mean, I would argue, a lot of times when we think of a crisis, we might think of something like the Civil War or a World War or something along those lines. But I would say that if you're looking at it from the standpoint of just an event that, really kind of put a little bit of a damper, if you will, on Americans, as far as like their enthusiasm for space. They were looking forward to this space shuttle going. And of course, only a few moments into the launch, of course, a lot of you are familiar with it exploding, blowing up. And that, of course, was a tragedy. But Reagan addressed that. But he also did a lot of other speeches too, right? So you're going to be analyzing that speech. You're also going to be analyzing a speech where he actually is talking to the American public about something that is a much different tone, which is what we call the Iran-Contra scandal. Okay, so that'll be in the activity that you do. And how does his approach to how he speaks, how he kind of, addresses the public, basically, say something about the way that he communicates to try to bring information to people. Reagan was, as a lot of you guys might know, his background, former actor. His first wife, Jane Wyman, was a former, actress as well. So, he's got that spirit of, the stage presence with which a lot of historians of political science would say that he definitely brings that into his presidency. Okay, so just really quick, what is going to stand out about Reagan's election in 1980? Well, at the time, he, of course, is going to be the oldest elected president in American history. Of course, that accolade, if you will since be part of the pun trumped by our current president. I'm sorry, 2016. But Reagan, if you all recall, just a real quick review, is going against the incumbent President Jimmy Carter. Um, Carter's approval rating is pretty low at this point in time. The Iranian hostage crisis, do not get that mixed up with the Contra scandal I just referenced, is basically in a position where, the economy is not as strong. You've got the crisis, you've got the energy problems, inflation is quite high. Therefore, the approval rating of President Carter is, I think, in the mid to high 20s. It is not going to bode well for his reelection. But the question is, when you think, guys, about this rise of Reagan conservatism, what are going to be some groups that basically support Reagan that are going to give him a lot of, shall we say, support and also, of course, voting? And one group is going to be a group called the Reagan Democrats, right? And it's very similar to the way it sounds. Reagan, if you didn't know this, just a real quick review, is actually going to be a Democrat for a lot of his earlier life. And, if you take a look, guys, at the 4 elections, just a quick example here, that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in 32, 36, 40, and 44, respectively. Reagan did vote, to my record knowledge, in all 4 of those elections for FDR. Okay. And so, you've got these people that have since changed party status that have been, registered Democrats. My grandmother, just a personal example here, had been a very strong, lifelong Democrat, was affected a lot by the Great Depression, as of course most Americans were in some way, shape, or form. And so she voted very consistently Democratic Party between the 30s and 1976. But for, a reason, I was only 9, 10 when she passed away, so it wasn't really something I got a chance to talk to her a lot about. But hearing stories about people that changed kind of like their voting, they didn't change their party affiliation as far as like changing what they were registered for those that were registered Democrat or Republican. But what they did do is they actually, in those elections, sided with President Reagan. Okay. And so, they're going to be liking his communication style, some of his policies, etc. Now, not all Democrats certainly did, right? If you were somebody who kind of had this mentality that the Reaganomics plan, which we'll look at more in a moment, was more geared toward helping out the business community and the upper class, then there were certainly criticisms out there. Okay. But a pretty substantial group of the Democratic base are to go in the direction of President Reagan in 80 and 84. Now, the other question is, well, what about this new right coalition? Well, think about it like this. Most of you have heard the expression right wing, right conservative factions of people. That's going to be pretty much a group. Like the moral majority was led by a gentleman by the name of Jerry Falwell. His picture, by the way, is above the cursor. That's going to be a group. A lot of people that were affiliated with Christian denominations. As you can imagine, they're going to have very strong views on a lot of things, from, traditional marriage stances to the idea of not being supportive of abortion rights, etc. So therefore, Reagan conservatism in a lot of ways is going to support a lot of this agenda. We'll get into that more in a second. It goes a little bit of a step further. But Reverend Falwell, the founder of Liberty University, if you've heard of that college before, is going to be very instrumental in the idea of rousing a lot of support with the evangelical Christian community. And of course, we know that it will work. Okay. So when we think of the new right or the new right coalition, or like I said, the moral majority supporting Reagan, we want to think of people that have more conservative, maybe even the word traditional kinds of values regarding family, smaller government, the idea that government should have restrictions to what it does to intervene in the economy, the environment, all these different things. And Reagan is elected by a pretty strong margin in 1980 over President Carter, and he's also going to be elected by a very strong landslide in 1984. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So a lot of people ask the question, they say, well, how does Reagan get established as a politician? Well, in 1964, he's been in the limelight, like I said, because of his involvement in Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 1964, he's been involved to an extent. He's eventually going to be elected as the governor of California. But in 1964, he makes one of the more famous speeches at the Republican National Convention. That was the convention that Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination, but he lost that presidency, if you all recall, to Lyndon B. Johnson. That was the election that he had following his succession to President Kennedy. Okay, and so Reagan makes a famous speech at that, and it kind of defines him changing party alliance and, more importantly, becoming, or at least establishing himself as a more well-known conservative. Okay, so after that, he goes on to hold the governorship of California, almost got the nomination over Ford in 1976, and in 1980, he's of course going to run on a pretty conservative platform. Okay, and if you're kind of wondering what is Reagan conservatism, you might want to pause your screen for just a moment before we move on and explain these more. But when you're looking at basic principles, okay, this is where we're going to take this to a different step. So where do we go from the idea of just knowing what these principles are to the idea of explaining them in greater detail, right? And that's going to be what we focus most of the rest of this session on. And the next session, we'll pick that up and we'll move into his foreign policy. But freedom, faith, family, founder's wisdom, right? So going back to the idea of the founding fathers of the United States, people that were probably a bit more associated with maybe a Jefferson-like thinking, but certainly the founding in general as well. Limited government, okay? This idea that our government, especially at the federal level, has become too expansive, right? It's exploded in size. It has to have limits, or shall we say restrictions to what it can do, all right? And we'll look at that in a moment. Of course, lower taxes is something that Reagan is very, very big on. There is potentially a downside with this when you're looking at the idea of increasing the military spending that will be associated with the last two things. And then what happens, you see a very large deficit developing, which also leads to a sizable debt. All right. So that's going to be one of the things, if you're, a fiscal conservative along the lines of not liking debt, then that's where there certainly are some different perspectives on the effects of Reagan, or at least his legacy along those lines. And then lastly, the last two things, guys, is definitely going to be peace through strength. In other words, building up military power. Okay. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that Reagan, being a two-term president, is going to deal with a lot of changes within the Soviet Union. Okay. So that's going to be what we look at a little bit more in our next session. But if you think about it, there's going to be several changes in leadership in the Soviet Union. The first couple of leaders, Reagan I think it's safe to say with accuracy that we're not on as good of terms with those leaders as we eventually will the leader that takes office in 1985, which is going to be Mikhail Gorbachev, right? And a lot of you have heard of him. And then he and Reagan develop a pretty good relationship. Some historians would even use the word friendship, okay? So kind of an important thing as they transition, and they have a lot of breakthroughs with, some things like the START 1 treaty, the INF treaty that was kind of a pretty important breakthrough as far as nuclear arms. I don't think it's a big secret for those of you that remember the SALT 1 treaty under Nixon, that Reagan was not a real big fan or even supporter of the idea that treaty was well adhered to by the Soviet Union. Okay, which basically brings about the last thing, and that is, even though he was more willing to work with a bit more cooperative Mikhail Gorbachev, that doesn't mean that Reagan is going to be, we're going to basically not, be looking to try to eventually defeat, communism. But there's a lot of debate about that, right? About, would we have had this eventual fall of the Berlin Wall, which, by the way, doesn't happen until his successor, talking about George H.W. Bush, was in office for about, what was it, about a little bit less than 10 months. But that's an interesting debate that all those young, up and coming, budding historians out there can certainly have an opinion about. So, like I said, please pause your screen, maybe take a few things down there, and we will basically continue this by looking at these in more detail with the next part of our presentation. Okay, U.S. history students, I hope you had time to preview those 8 or 9 principles. We're going to do a very quick run through of these using this additional PowerPoint. This is a little bit longer, but nonetheless, I think you'll find it to be very informative. So these are pretty much in a pretty similar order. But the question is about Reagan and freedom. The big question here when you're getting into economics, which we'll look at Reaganomics in more detail in a moment, why did Ronald Reagan intertwine freedom so closely with economic ideas and more specifically free market capitalism? Well, the idea, I don't know if all historians would agree with this, but if you all remember the idea of laissez-faire, the idea of the government staying as far away from the market and the economy as possible. Now, a couple of things that we have to keep in mind here is that Reagan is trying to implement conservatism in a time period where we've already had the progressive movement. Of course, some of the policies of people like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, right? So you've got like the FDA and, of course, the even like going back to Wilson guys with the monetary of the monetary policy, right? And we call that basically monetary policy as far as, how much money is in circulation. So Reagan is probably not going to be able to do what he maybe would have been able to do with like the 20s presidencies with people like, Coolidge and Hoover, even Harding to an extent. But he is going to try to implement some of these policies, deregulation, taking more, having less, government regulation over spheres of our economy like the environment. And essentially what that does is it puts more freedom in the hands of producers and companies and things like that to actually be able to have less restrictions. Therefore, they're going to be able to expand production. Now, there are some potential downsides with that, which, those of you that are familiar with things like, some of the oil spills in the past, there's arguments to be made that those are things that, when government is more involved in regulating, that you don't have as many possibilities of those kinds of things happening. Of course, accidents are prone to happen regardless, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so basically, just a real quick quote: if we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. Again, Reagan is very well known for sound bites. Okay, those one-liners, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. That's one of the most famous statements that he makes in his inaugural. The other one that a lot of you have heard of, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, right? That goes back to his address in his second term. I think it was in 1987, and of course in Berlin. Okay, and so the idea of freedom. Well, if you believe in freedom, the argument on the part of Reagan is that you have greater trust in who? The people, to make their own decisions regarding the economy and things along those lines. All right, so I'm not going to go over all these. You can pause if you need to, but again, the idea of lower taxes is definitely going to be something that we find. Okay, and then of course with the economy, freedom of choice. Okay, and that's one of the arguments. Okay, you have more money in your pocket, because you have less taxes. Therefore, you can basically determine your own success, your own decision making. Okay, and so whether that's a good idea or not, again, the principles here, profit motive, all of those in many cases go back to the idea of Adam Smith, right? The Wealth of Nations. Those of you that have been in my class this year, we've talked a little bit about him. When you think of probably the manual, of free market capitalism, that's pretty much going to be what we associate with it, right? Laissez-faire, less government involvement is the best economy, that kind of thing. Okay. And so again, in the market, cut taxes, again, guys, a lot of this stuff is kind of moving into connecting the idea of less government involvement. And then as far as faith, right? Well, a lot of times when we think of faith, we think of religion. In this case, like we said a moment ago, a lot of the religious rights, Christian, people that are going to be very big on Reagan and some of his rhetoric and some of his views and things. But the idea is that freedom basically relied heavily on faith, and that should be obviously supported. Okay. And so you'll notice, who's that figure that's on the right here in this picture? A lot of you are able to answer that correctly. The Pope, right? The Pope is going to make a pretty important venture to, of course, the United States in the 80s. Okay. And I think it's interesting. Faith infuses the soul with a sanctifying grace that allows humans in a free society, right? Free being the key word there, to love and to serve their neighbor, to think about more than themselves. Okay. So the idea that, if you truly are a person of faith, then you're going to basically have this mentality of helping those in need, that kind of thing. And that's a pretty conservative viewpoint of how even the church, not trying to proselytize here, but if people that believe in conservative, faith principles, they would say, hey, that's why we do missions. That's why we obviously tithe, we give to the church, we support things outside of just giving more money to the government to do things. Okay. So I'll let you all kind of be, land your plane on that, but it's something to definitely keep in mind. Okay. And so again, whether you're pro-choice, anti-choice, whatever, that's for you all to kind of land your plane on. He is going to support more of an agenda. Now that would be obviously the opposite of Roe v. Wade, but technically on paper, that is still a constitutional position by the U.S. Supreme Court, even in the modern day. Okay, so you can have that position, and of course it's going to appeal to a certain voter base, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay, and then even as a lot of you guys remember, like in the 50s with the rise of the second Red Scare, and some of the focus on like godless communism, right? You even see that again popping up, this empire of evil, kind of like this Star Wars kind of mentality with the evil empire. Had to throw that in there, given the Star Wars. It is the May the 4th be with you week. And so what do you notice? That the idea of political oppression in a society that doesn't really allow for a lot of that, that's a pretty big thing to keep in mind. Okay. And then founder's wisdom. Who's that guy on the right? Correct. People like George Washington. Okay. And so for a lot of people, this is not just unique to Reagan, but you see, guys, a lot of people that quote, these earlier figures and principles. Makes a lot of sense. Life, liberty, property, this idea of these are heroic figures that have obviously had a pretty important thing. Keep in mind, Reagan's last year in office, 1988, well, technically his last full year, I should say, is going to be that 200th year remembrance or anniversary, if you will, of the formal ratification of the United States Constitution, right? So again, building up this patriotism and nationalism toward the founding and things along those lines, okay? And so Founders Wisdom Part 2, stricter interpretation of the Constitution. That would be a bit more, guys, if you remember, strict being kind of by the book. Now, I think it's interesting, you focus a lot on people like Thomas Jefferson with that, but yet, when he was president, he does, go against some of that wisdom, if you will, with, how he dealt with like the, of course, the Louisiana Purchase, that kind of thing. Okay. But, Reagan is going to take some strong positions against the extreme expansion of government, even some of the Social Security, and then even some of the LBJ Great Society, right? Which I think is interesting given the fact that, Reagan does vote Democratic a lot in his earlier career in the 30s and 40s. And then, of course, he changes tune as you move into the 60s and, of course, beyond. Okay. Limited government. Again, one of his most famous sound bites. Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Look at what he says here, very similar. It is not my intention to do away with the government. Okay. Well, what is his intention? Well, perhaps to size it down some. Okay. Which, by the way, the argument is that sizing it down, a lot of people are like, well, that should be an easy thing to do. No. You got to remember, a lot of these programs have people associated with them on, they're getting the benefits, but also people that actually execute, through executive agencies, ergo jobs. Okay. So, but I think it's interesting again in his farewell address. So this is when he's leaving office. He kind of comes back to a very similar principle. Man is not free unless government is what? Limited. Okay. And so private sector emphasis. Now, if you're kind of wondering, those of you that are maybe new to some of the history and some of the politics, every so often, guys, on the news, you'll come across like expressions like public sector and private sector. You're basically private sector, for the most part, is functions that are outside of like government. So that would be like, if somebody starts a business, that would usually be associated with the private sector, whereas maybe a job or a program that is geared toward helping out the public. Right. So things that usually come to mind, if all of you probably have heard of Social Security, Medicare, some of those programs, those are going to be more public sector kind of things. They all have jobs associated with those people. And of course, Reagan, while he's a lot like Eisenhower in this respect, I would say, he understands you are not going to be able, excuse me, guys, to get rid of those. Remember what pretty much Eisenhower said to his brother when his brother was kind of critical of him. He was like, if we get rid of a lot of these things of the New Deal, then you know what we can pretty much do? We can pretty much put the death nail in our party. Okay. Well, you got to remember, fast forward the clock almost 50 years since 1932, and that's around 1980. Fast forward the clock, almost 20 years by 1960 or 84, pardon me. That's 20 years after this great society of LBJ starts to have, shall we say, some attention brought to it. Okay. So something to definitely keep in mind. Okay. So I'm not going to say a lot more about this, but again, deficit is still going to be something that Reagan is going to have as a problem as we go throughout his presidency, and we'll look at that more later. Deficits decreased at the end, but during a lot of that earlier phase of his first term and also part of the second term, as you can see here, those, again, deficits are going to go up between then and also here. Okay. So what do you notice about this? You notice that a lot of emphasis on things like deficit spending, because you're increasing, guys, a lot of spending on the military. Reagan saw that, as we'll see here in a second, guys, a very, very big piece of the puzzle with that. Okay. And then lower taxes. You can pause this if you need to. But again, the idea of extending tax cuts to all Americans, but the biggest group of Americans, as we'll see, guys, here in a few minutes, that are going to have the biggest area of tax cuts is definitely going to be the group that we associate with the business class. Some people would say the wealthy class, and that's one reason why, if you were somebody who was sometimes not as Reagan Democrat like to vote, still voting with the Democratic Party like my mom was, her argument is, or was, pardon me, that there should have been, there should not have been that widening gap between the people that are wealthy and the people that are on the middle class, the poor side. Okay. And so anyway, those criticisms are certainly out there for reasons we'll look at more in a moment. Okay. So again, guys, we're seeing a pattern here: reducing government size, decreasing federal income tax. Okay. Um, and then, of course, the four pillars. I don't know if you have to memorize all these, but definitely tax cuts, deregulation. Basically, what we're getting at there, guys, is less government regulation on some elements of the American economy, especially. Okay. And then again, that better management of the money supply, which goes back to monetary policy. Okay. Something interesting to keep in mind, and this is where you see the tax cut. Excuse me, I should have left that there. Um, but again, if you're somebody who owns big business, let's put ourselves in the position of somebody like Bill Gates, later on, people like Steve Jobs, et cetera, big names that we've all heard of. Um, when Reagan basically is first elected, the corporate income tax level, basically the amount that you're paying on your profits, was about 70%. And Reagan and the Democratic Congress are eventually going to be able to have a compromise to get that number from 70 all the way as far as low as 28%. Okay. Now, the thing to keep in mind, guys, remember Reagan takes office around 1981. Okay. This does not happen right away, right? That full tax cut, right? So you're going to see that in bits and pieces, 70% to 50, 50 to 35 or whatever it was, and then eventually down to 28. So this is a series of tax cuts. Okay. But the thing that's interesting about this, guys, is that Reagan is going to have to work with a Democratic House, which actually, as a lot of you guys know, a lot of these spending bills and tax cuts and things like that are going to have to originate, at least, when the founding happened, in the House of Representatives. So that makes being able to work with your Congress, obviously, it's a no-brainer to say it's important to begin with. But when you're looking at the idea of reducing taxes and things like that, you're going to have to be able to work with them, right? And Reagan is going to have, I would argue, some success with doing that. Okay. And then last but not least, peace through strength. Now, we're not going to say a lot about the Strategic Defense Initiative until our next session, but that's going to be one of the bigger things that you hear about as far as what it was supposed to do, the cost, the concept of it, as you can see, is right there. We'll talk a little bit about that in our next session. But again, what do we notice? Reagan really believes in building up military strength. Okay. So, he makes a comment in one of his famous addresses where he says something along the lines, a nuclear war is something that should never be thought and should never be fought, or something like that. Okay. I would 100% agree with them. But as a lot of you guys know, we've had that theory of mutually assured destruction that's been here for years and years. Okay. And so the question is, all right, why would you want to build up your military? Well, keep in mind, SDI, the second word there, defense. Okay. That is basically what a lot of this is going to be geared toward. Okay. So, who would basically say, well, it's a bad idea to be able to defend yourself? That's going to be what a lot of this SDI is designed to do. Okay. And as you can see, this is a pretty sophisticated concept. Okay. And as you can imagine, this would also have been extremely costly, right? Which we'll talk more about later. Okay. So the question is, all right, if you start to build up your military, whether it's through troop numbers or, missiles or even SDI, this is big. Negotiate reduction. It gives you a bargaining tool, right? To be able to basically maybe have a bit more bark to your bite, or whatever word you want to use. Compromise with the Soviets and avoid showing weakness. Okay. And then prompt Soviets to sign agreements to eliminate missiles on both sides. And that actually is going to, the START one, and then also INF that is signed in 1987, I believe that was, or later. That's a big, big thing to keep in mind. Okay. And then, of course, when we think of the Cold War and American policy, we're looking at the idea of communism being obviously opposite, or shall we say, kind of like on the opposite side of course, what we associate with American ideals. Okay. Um, and so again, what do we notice? Guys, check this out. Defense budget. Now, I don't think you have to memorize these numbers. Those of you that know me, I'm not going to say how much did the budget go up, but you definitely need to understand, guys, giving some degree of context here. I mean, this is a pretty big change over the course of a 4-year period of time. Okay. So he inherits, 1981 when he first took office, our defense budget, as you can see there, $171 billion. I can't fathom that many zeros, but that's what it was. When he's up for starting his second term after his reelection in 1984, that's where we actually see that number up to 300 billion, right? Which you could say, well, man, Mr. Baker, in 2020, that number is substantially higher. Yes, that is true. All right. But you got to remember, we're still talking about the idea of building up military to be able to defend ourselves. All right. That peace through strength idea. Okay. Now, it's very easy. We're not going to spend a lot of time, guys, looking at these today, but our next session, we'll come back to it. The idea of our involvement outside of just, trying to build SDI to deal with the Soviets, all those things are pretty important. Okay. So we're going to stop there for the moment and come back and do a very quick unpacking of Reagan's first term and some of his bigger domestic policies. Then we'll basically continue our next session with his second term, and also we'll continue to look at his foreign policy. Okay, so guys, did you hopefully enjoyed learning a little bit about Reagan's big principles of how he tried to kind of promote conservatism? I know that was a lot of stuff for you to take, but again, the big picture are some things to really kind of focus on, because we're going to wrap up looking at domestic things today and then transition mostly to foreign policy tomorrow with a little bit of emphasis on his second term and a few domestic things. All right, so we talked about this conservative approach. Now, keep in mind, Reagan inherits a pretty volatile economy, okay? And what does that mean? It means that you've got a lot of issues with inflation. You've got a lot of things. The energy crisis is still trying to transition from that. Consequently, keep in mind that the issue with Iran, while we do actually have the hostages actually released, our relations with them are still going to continue to not be good, even into literally right now. Okay. And so we talked about this term Reaganomics, aka supply side economics. Okay. And so it's more complex than this. We're going to try to make, those of you that have had me in class before, I like to try to break this down as easily as possible. Okay. And so really, when you're looking at the idea of supply side economics, first of all, when we think of supply, we should automatically think of the idea of people that are actually producing, ergo companies. What do you got to have to obviously be able to produce things? You got to be able to have people working. You're going to be able to have new technology. Okay. Well, the problem is these companies don't have the money. And Reagan's part of his argument is that if you're going to basically give them the incentive to actually produce, ergo making more things, okay, supply, then they have to basically have the financial capital to be able to do it. And keep in mind what we said before, these people are paying about 70% of their profit to some kind of income tax. So that's where the idea of tax cuts comes into play. Remember that number, 70 to 28% between 1981 and 1989, when he's on the verge of leaving office. Okay. So when we're talking about the idea of giving these companies more money in their pockets, they're going to receive the biggest amount of tax relief or tax incentives, or whatever word you want to use. Now you might say, well, man, that's where you get that idea of a wider gap between the rich and the poor. All right. And those of you that want to Google this, if you Google like Reaganomics or something along the lines of widening gap between the rich and the poor, there's a wonderful political cartoon that you can actually see where you've got a kind of like a fountain of different social classes. And of course, the class that's getting the least amount of tax relief is the lower class or even the middle class. And the group that's getting the highest number is going to, of course, be the upper class or even the business class. All right. So, anyway, something to keep in mind there. Okay. And so you give them an incentive. They have more money. They can invest in new technology. They therefore will need to employ more people. Therefore, unemployment rate is going to go down and the economy is going to grow. Now, a couple of you are like, well, man, that sounds like an interesting plan. I can tell you, first of all, this does not happen right away. Okay. So within about the first year and a half to 2 years of Reagan's first term, between 1981 and 1983, you have a lot of problems here. Recession, the rest of recession conditions are going to worsen. And it's like, man, but they stayed the course and the economy is going to improve along those lines. But what's the pro and con? Well, the pro is that the economy is going to improve from the standpoint of unemployment rates going down, things like that. But what's the downside? Well, the downside is, again, when you're giving massive tax cuts, you have less revenue, and you're also increasing the spending, through like the military spending, and you're not reducing the government spending as much as probably Reagan would have liked to. That's when you're going to see those deficits going up and up and up. So you all can kind of land your plane on that, but where do you kind of weigh the pros and the cons? Okay. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. And then our last major slide before we wrap this up is when you're looking at deregulation, you're looking at things like, for example, everybody's heard of the EPA before. You would say, okay, well, we're not going to have as many restrictions on things like oil drilling or something along the lines of those kinds of things. What does that do? It's going to give companies less restriction, and it's going to give them more freedom to be able to obviously carry out certain things. Okay, so if you're an environmentalist, which a good number of voters could be, this might not be the best thing in the world, because the question is, we looked at this in the previous slideshow, guys. Does the average person have as much trust toward a person having this much freedom to operate as Reagan would? And of course, that's a hypothetical question, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay. Less federal government philosophy. Let's transfer some of this federal responsibility to the states. This new federalism. Who was the guy that introduced this in the late 60s, early 70s? Richard Nixon. Reagan is going to have his own way of doing it to an extent, but it's a very similar kind of thing. And then last but not least, the idea of Reagan's leadership. Now, the AIDS problem is going to get, or shall we say, the AIDS situation is going to receive a lot more attention. Those of you that remember like the sexual revolution in the 60s and some of the things that, those of you that have seen Forrest Gump, you notice I'm kind of giving a little bit of it away, so I apologize if you haven't seen it. But, when Jenna returns and, obviously, they have a son together and she's explaining to him, the doctors have diagnosed her with something, but they don't know exactly all the details and what it is. Well, fast forward the clock to the early 90s when the movie was made, and we all know what it is. Of course, it's going to be, AIDS. Okay. And so this gets a lot of attention for those kinds of reasons. Okay. But from the standpoint of patriotism, leadership, we do hold the Olympics in 1984 in Los Angeles. The interesting thing was, remember under Carter in 80, Moscow hosted them. and America actually boycotted them. The same is going to happen on the Soviet Union side in 1984. Okay. And then last but not least, two of the bigger things that I really appreciate about Reagan is you'll notice that the first Supreme Court justice that was a female, Sandra Day O'Connor, was actually put on the bench very early into Reagan's first year in office. Okay. She is no longer on the court. We do, however, keep in mind we have 3 out of 9 justices. Okay. So therefore, there's been a lot of change in regards to that. So a third of the court now is made up of women, right? Which is a pretty important, if you want to use the word breakthrough or whatever. Okay. And then, of course, the day that all of us celebrate in some way in January, which is going to be, the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. and his approach to civil rights and his leadership. And so if you think about it, guys, Reagan is going to have, he can't do all these things, of course, on his own. He has to have people confirming Sandra Day O'Connor. He has to have people support, the hosting of the Olympics. He has to have Congress support some of these policies, and of course, making this a national holiday. But he does some good things. I'm going to leave you there with the next session to watch. But I hope you all are doing great. This is Baker's Corner. Feel free to email me with any questions. Stay safe. And as always, I hope you're enjoying our presidency. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Have a good day.